On August 9th, 1995, Alison Hargreaves and 11 other climbers stood at K2's Camp 4, staring up at the final push to the summit. It was the moment every climber dreams of, and fears. 5 of them would turn back halfway, but Allison and the others pressed on. Hours later, they would wish more than anything that they had done the same, because what waited them high on the savage mountain would become one of mountaineering's most heartbreaking tragedies. But the story doesn't end there. Nearly 24 years later, Allison's own son, Tom Ballard, would follow in her footsteps. On Nanga Parbat, just 100 miles from K2, he and his climbing partner, Daniele Nardi, would face a fate every bit as chilling. Welcome to the extreme edge. The year was 1995, and Alison Hargreaves had just summited K2 as a solo climber and without supplemental oxygen. But something devastating was about to happen to her on her way down. It wasn't because of the conditions she challenged herself with. Rather, it was something far more haunting. Allison was so interested in mountaineering since her childhood in the United Kingdom, where she was born. By the age of 9, she could already outpace her parents on Ben Nevis. By the time Alison Hargreaves was 13, she had fallen in love with rock climbing so much that it became the only part she looked forward to at school. However, the thing was, Allison's parents were academics. In fact, they were Oxford mathematicians, and they expected their children to follow in their footsteps. Maybe it had something to do with the stereotype of how middle-born children can be rebellious, or Allison was just naturally determined. But Allison wasn't going to compromise her dreams for her parents. So even though she aced her exams for university, Allison refused to enroll and instead fully immersed herself into rock climbing. Allison spent so much time in the climbing world that it was almost natural that she fell for someone in that circle. Jim Ballard owned a mountaineering gear store where Allison worked to afford her rock climbing ambitions. He was also a climber, although he was content as a seller instead. At the age of 18, Allison left her parents' home and moved in with Jim. This relationship marked a turning point because it was with Jim that Allison went from being an ambitious rock climber to a dedicated mountaineer. Slowly but steadily, Allison honed her skills in the Alps, and on every single trip, she pushed her limits. By 1986, only 4 years later, her climbing resume was so impressive that she joined the Alpine Club. That's one of the oldest and most prestigious mountaineering organizations in the world. At this point, Allison was climbing not just because she loved mountains so much, but also to show all those who had second thoughts that she was as indeed extraordinary as she thought of herself. And what better way to show them that by etching her name in history? So, from that moment, whenever she considered doing a climb, she thought of how she could make it a record. So that same year she joined the Alpine Club, Allison climbed alongside renowned alpinists and made history not just as the first British woman to summit Kontega in Nepal, but as the first Brit ever to achieve that feat. It was groundbreaking, not just because she did it first, but because she ascended from the steep and icy northwest face, and that was a path nobody had taken before. Also, she made the 16th ascent ever on the mountain. This was a 22-year-old woman with exceptional technical ability. Then in the autumn of 1987, Allison returned to Nepal again, this time to summit the 22,349 feet high Ama de Blanc. This was the first time Allison would decide to forfeit a summit, even though the summit was just in sight, but it would still not be her last. Still, she was able to push as high as about 18,700 feet. If you think that with all her achievements as a young adult, Allison would have become popular and already gotten sponsorship deals, then you would be shocked to find out that it wasn't true. But all that was about to dramatically change in 1988, when 24-year-old Allison ascended the Eiger's North Face. It was a great feat, considering the technical strength required to pull it off successfully. It wasn't her ability that got her on the headlines. The fact that she climbed while 6 months pregnant was remarkable. The media ran wild, and critics began to accuse her of recklessness. But when Allison would respond to all said and done, she said, "I was pregnant, not sick." Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be a part of the extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. I can only imagine how disappointed she must have felt, with people focusing so intensely on her decision to climb during her third trimester rather than her numerous other accomplishments. Her husband's business was declining rapidly, and she had hoped that with some publicity, she could secure sponsorships to support her. After all, they were in debt due to her past expeditions. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Their little family had to sell their house and move away to Switzerland. There, Allison lived a simple life as a homemaker, nurturing Tom and Kate, who she gave birth to in 1990. Tom and his younger sister Kate, through their formative years, and working a regular job in her children's school. For a moment, the world seemed to forget about her, and the people who didn't forget about her thought she had given up the adrenaline-pumped life. Imagine how shocked the mountaineering community was when Allison made a sudden appearance in 1993, but it was what she did next that blew their mind. Allison set out to become the first person ever to solo climb all 6 great north faces of the Alps in a single summer climbing season. Those are Eiger, Matterhorn, Grand Juras, Petit Dreux, Piz Badile, and Cima Grande di Lavaredo. To top it all off, her total climbing time across all faces was under 24 hours. To me, that is a massive comeback. Tom must have watched in awe as his mom showed pictures of her on those faces, and that must have been a core moment for the 5-year-old. Allison finally had the attention of sponsors, and she became unstoppable with her records. She was the first woman to solo the Crow's Spur on Grand Juras in one day. She was the first British woman to climb the north face of Les Droites and the Super Couloir on Mont Blanc du Tacul. She also made several other first female solo ascents. So when Allison announced in 1994 that she was going to summit the 3 highest and most dangerous mountains in the world, Everest, K2, and Kinchenjunga, it didn't come as a shocker. But that wasn't all, because to Allison, summiting was only an attempt. The real challenge lies in how hard you push yourself. So she set off to Everest, and the world held its breath for history to be made. And Allison tried, but she didn't believe any mountain was worth losing her life over. So, when she began to feel numbness in her fingers, she made a decision to turn around. That goes to show that despite her determination, Allison knew when to stop. It was probably the first time that her son realized that his mother was not indestructible. But in 1995, she tried again, and this time around, she made it to the highest peak in the world, not just as a successful summiter, but as the first female to solo climb Everest without bottled oxygen. She was over the moon, and a few months later, Allison prepared to embark on the second phase of her mission, which was to replicate the same feat on K2. But K2 was not like Everest. Even though Everest was almost 1,000 feet higher, K2 offered a different level of challenge. Everest is massive and has defined ridges, which means, as an experienced mountaineer, climbing the mountain shouldn't be the problem. The major issue, or cause of death on Everest, is the high altitude levels that affects the body's system. But on K2, even experienced climbers could fall off or get crushed by unstable seracs. There are no sections where you can simply walk the distance, and what's worse, the weather is unpredictable. 1 in 4 who manage to stand on its summit never make it back down alive. All of these are what earned K2 the nickname Savage Mountain. But Allison knew all these stats and facts before setting her sights on it and deciding to not just summit, but to do it solo and without supplementary oxygen. So, in the summer of 1995, she kissed her husband and hugged 6-year-old Tom and his sister Kate goodbye and made her way to K2's base camp. The base camp was alive with ambition that summer. Expeditions from Spain, New Zealand, the United States, and Mexico all gathered at the foot of the mountain, waiting for a weather window. But snowstorms hammered the mountain in buried tents and blizzards. On K2, patience is not just a virtue, it's a core skill, and Allison had it. So she waited the weather out for the rest of June and for the whole of July, and by the 6th of August, she had been up to Camp 3 twice and Camp 4 once, climbing a little higher to just above 26,246 feet. By now, only she and expedition leader Rob Slater were left from her initial team. People were leaving, not just from her group, but across the base camp. By August 9th, only 11 climbers remained to take advantage of the suddenly cleared weather window. They reached Camp 3, only to discover that it had been buried by an avalanche. You might be wondering why a camp was made in an avalanche path, but on K2, everywhere is an avalanche path. They spent an hour trying to locate their tents, then continued to Camp 4. They arrived there on the 11th of August, and mercifully, it was still standing. The next day could have been a good summit day, but after the long climbs from the previous day, all 12 climbers, including Allison, decided to spend a rest day in camp. They couldn't afford to be exhausted on the final summit push. Off they went on August 13th for the summit, but just before reaching the Bottleneck Couloir, 5 of the climbers turned around. You see, the Bottleneck Couloir is a notorious section on that route where climbers have to ascend under an enormous serac that could collapse at any moment. Among those more cautious climbers was Peter Hillary, the son of Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Everest. Peter noticed that the atmosphere had gotten colder and decided to descend as far as he could. He turned out to be right on the money. A system of warm, moist air was coming up the valley from the south, where it was about to collide with a powerful anticyclone coming from the North Chinese side of the mountain. When something like that happens, it can lead to hurricane-force winds and blizzards. A massive storm was coming, and it was coming fast. Peter was descending just below the Black Pyramid, roughly 2,000 to 4,000 feet from where he had turned around on Camp 4, when the storm hit him. He was stuck in a storm that was going over 100 miles an hour. As he struggled to get himself together, he dreaded what was coming for the group that had continued up the summit. By late afternoon, the group reached the summit, 28,251 feet above sea level. Allison had done it. She imagined the news reaching her home, especially her little boy who shared her deep love and always stood by the phone waiting for news of her summit. Allison couldn't wait to tell him that she had stood on top of the Savage Mountain. But on mountains like K2, the summit is only halfway, and Allison was unaware of the storm headed their way. The group had only begun their descent when the storm caught up with them. They were instantly in a state of frenzy. One by one, Allison watched the winds blow away her group members until it was her turn to let go. I wonder what was going through her mind in that split second. Did she think about her family, her supportive husband, and her loving children? Did memories of her early days camping happily with her parents flood her mind? Or did she simply accept the mountain as her final resting place? Eventually, death literally swept Alison Hargreaves off her feet. With the force of the wind and the height from which she fell, Allison must have died from the blunt trauma injury she sustained. And perhaps the exposure to harsh weather made things worse. I try to imagine that moment when Allison's husband received the tragic news that his wife was no more, watching the hopeful eyes of his children and having to tell them that their hero was never going to return. He summoned courage and broke it to his children. Even though Kate was just 4 years old, she seemed to understand. But for 6-year-old Tom, the pain struck him at an even deeper level. Base camps were like playgrounds for Tom, and mountaintops were not distant dreams to him. He had actually seen his mom summit these places like it was a regular walk in the market. But after that disaster struck in 1995 and he lost his hero, Tom became quiet, and if you looked into his eyes, you could see the sadness of a little boy who missed his mother. Jim Ballard, their father, did all he could to help Tom and his sister Kate feel closer to their mother, first by taking them to the base of K2 right after Allison died. You might think that since he had lost his wife to an adventure on the peaks, he would want his children to live a more sheltered life. But Jim was never like that. Back when his wife was alive, he had supported her with everything he had, and after her death, he transferred all that support to his children. So, when Tom came back from school one day and declared he wanted to be a climber, Jim did not convince him otherwise. Maybe he saw a mini version of his wife in his son, or he was just a really supportive father. Jim became Tom's climbing partner and gave him that parental support Allison never enjoyed. Despite how quiet Tom was, he had a passion that was even stronger than his mother's. By the time he and his family moved away from the Scottish Highlands to the Dolomites in 2009, he had become an excellent multifaceted climber. He did rock climbing, mixed climbing, dry tooling, alpinism, and even extreme snow sports. He was often focused on establishing his own new routes or freeing previously aided ones. Tom always said Eiger felt like a second home to him. And maybe that was because his mother had climbed the north face of Eiger while pregnant with him. By the time Tom was 20, he executed a solo first ascent on the Eiger and even opened a new 2,953-foot rock route that he had named 7 Pillars of Wisdom as a nod to T.E. Lawrence. The next year, he climbed Eiger again, and this time he completed the first solo winter ascent of the Piola Sprongli route on the north face. You might notice that he was going for firsts and naming routes, which is a power move to get your name etched in the history books. I think that reminds me of his mother's determination to only do feats that got her a place in the Mountaineering Book of Records. But if you could ask Tom, he would deny that he was climbing for her legacy and tell you he was climbing for himself. 3 years later, Tom established another first, this time in the Dolomites' iconic Catinacho. It was the winter, and Tom did a free ascent up the Olympia, going for Gold Route. And then that same year, he opened a new route on the Agashorn in the Bernese Oberland and cheekily titled it, "If Genghis Can, We Can." Typical Tom with his childlike humor. Yes, Tom was already popular even before he became a professional climber, but it was between December 2014 and March 2015 that he reached the peak of his celebrity. It is one thing to climb all 6 great north faces of the Alps in 1 year. It is another thing to climb all of them in a single summer climbing season like his mom did. But it is something else entirely to solely climb those great 6 north faces of the Alps in a single winter season. I mean, without any support or team. It was mind-blowing. Tom smashed his mom's record and solidified his place among the elites of alpinism. If Allison could see that moment, she must have been so proud of him. In the course of the winter, Tom also completed remarkably fast ascents of these formidable walls, such as soloing the 1938 Heckmeyer route on the Eiger in 5 hours 38 minutes, despite falling ill. Tom wasn't just a professional climber, he was a brave man as well. To document the project, the film Tom was produced, which garnered numerous international awards, including Best Mountaineering Film at the Kendall Mountain Festival in 2015, along with prizes across Bansko, Gorny Skega, Autrains, Sheffield, Dutch Film Festival, Cervino Cinemountain, and more. In 2016, Tom's appetite for pushing boundaries took him into mixed and dry tool climbing. Dry tooling is a climbing discipline where climbers ascend rock faces using ice axes and crampons, basically treating the rock as if it were ice. I think that takes extreme sports to another level, but with Tom, you should always expect the unexpected, because he didn't just take up the sport, he began to open routes in it. At first, he did a grueling 26-pitch new rock climb on the north face of Civetta in the Dolomites called Dirty Harry. Then he opened a new mixed route on the Eiger's north face and named it Titanic. By now, he had become well versed in the art of dry tooling, and so he decided that all the dry tooling routes in the Dolomites were not hard enough. So that same year, Tom established a dry tooling route in the Dolomites, which he called A Line Above the Sky. That route was the world's hardest dry tooling route for a long time. Then in 2017, he met Daniele Nardi, an Italian climber who had been attempting a few mountains for years without success. Daniele must have heard all about Tom's resilience and intense knowledge, so he brought up a new type of challenge for him. They were to climb the northeast face of Linksar, a 23,100-foot peak in Pakistan. First of all, Tom barely went up mountains as high as that. Secondly, that route had never been climbed before. But trust Tom to take on a risky mission. Together with Daniele, he attempted the mountain. It's unclear what exactly happened on that attempt, but those two did not succeed in reaching the summit. But in 2019, the duo teamed up once again, not for Linksar, but for an even more challenging mountain called Nanga Parbat. Nanga Parbat is the 9th highest mountain in the world, but one of the least attempted mountains of over 26,000 feet. Climbers generally try to avoid the mountain because of its steepness and unstable weather. Before anyone was able to successfully summit Nanga Parbat, 30 people had already lost their lives. It wasn't just about the altitude level, it was about the falling ice, avalanches, exposure, and sometimes just sheer exhaustion. It even used to have a fatality rate of around 22%. No wonder it got nicknamed the Killer Mountain. That was the mountain Tom decided to take his partner Daniela, even though it was probably more of Daniela's decision. You see, Daniela had long been interested in not just summiting Nanga Parbat, but doing so through one of the deadliest routes, the Mummery Spur. The Mummery Spur was an almost mythic route, ever since the first attempt in 1895 by Albert F. Mummery, till Tom and Daniela's climb. Every single attempt on the spur had failed. It was even considered a death route. Daniela had tried several times to successfully make it up the mountain, but had failed every single time. But he hoped that with brave and young Tom, he could finally make his name in the mountaineering world. By January, they began to push up the spur. The climb was a battle with the elements from the start. Every step meant wading through waist-deep snow, every ledge a potential trapdoor of ice. They hacked out a platform for Camp 1 at the base of the spur. They inched their way up to Camp 2, halfway up the ridge. Higher still, they scraped out a precarious shelter in a crevasse at 18,701 feet. This became Camp 3, a place exposed to the full force of the Himalayan winter. The wind never seemed to stop there. It shrieked through fissures and rattled the tent poles until it was impossible. Tom called the conditions bloomin' awful, an understatement that masked the extremity of their ordeal. Temperatures plunging below -40, gusts strong enough to knock a man off his feet, snowstorms that buried the tents as quickly as they could dig them out. Again and again, they tried to advance, and each time they were driven back. Avalanche risk was constant. The spur was loaded with snow that hung like a blade above their line, ready to cut loose without warning. They had to turn around. Unfortunately, a roaring slide of ice and snow already destroyed the very path they climbed a few minutes earlier. Each attempt to go any higher ended in exhaustion and a retreat to the thin comfort of base camp. 2 Pakistani climbers who had joined them in support abandoned the expedition by mid-February, calling the risks unbearable. But Tom and Daniela remained, a 2-man team against a giant of stone and ice. Their persistence carried them as high as 20,669 feet. From there, they could see the great sweep of the Diamir face. And that was progress. On February 24th, Daniela made a call to his sponsor from the high camp. He said they planned to descend to Camp 4 at 19,685 feet to avoid an oncoming storm. Then later told base camp they would instead push lower to Camp 3, the crevasse camp at 18,701 feet. But after that call came pitch silence. For days, no one knew where they had gone. When they failed to reappear, the search began, led by Basque climber Alex Chacon, who flew in despite worsening weather and political tensions on the India-Pakistan border. Helicopters circled the face and drones buzzed over the spur as the searchers prayed and hoped that they'd find the duo camped out somewhere, waiting for help. On March 5th, the drone spotted 2 shapes fixed against the slope. Closer inspection confirmed the truth. It was Tom and Daniela, lying at 19,030 feet, roped together, motionless in the white. In a chilling coincidence, their bodies were found only 100 miles away from where Alison Hargreaves' body had been for 24 years prior. The same winds that had blown Allison away from K2 had created the violent storms that had stranded Tom on his way up the Nanga Parbat, as if warning him to turn back around. If there is such a thing as ghosts, then I wonder if Allison recognized her boy when she was with him. I wonder if she felt proud that Tom filled her enormous shoes and walked in her footsteps. And I wonder if that hidden sadness in Tom's eyes vanished at the sight of his mom. The mother and son story started with the same determination and ended similarly. And for that, I feel their stories will forever remain intertwined. I think these stories are heroic and full of passion. Let me know what you think about them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.